So we'd like to start by saying that it's a great honor to be asked by the AI to give a lecture. As Fergus had said, we've been attending these lectures for many, what seems like many years. In fact, I think the lectures were probably in black and white when we started. And I suppose these lectures have made a big contribution to developing our enthusiasm and our understanding of architecture, as well as at the same time, I think, making a huge contribution that we'd all acknowledge to the culture of architecture in Ireland. So I suppose we'd like to just start by thanking the current committee, obviously, for inviting us to give a lecture, but also to current and previous committees for all of the huge amount of voluntary time and energy that has gone into keeping this program of events running over the years. I suppose the other thing we'd like to say just at the beginning is that architecture is obviously a collaborative endeavour, and we have been extremely lucky to have a number of really good collaborators, both in the office and externally. But I suppose we'd like to acknowledge, obviously, at the moment, Jennifer O'Donnell and Conor Maguire, who've been working with us basically for the last couple of years, who are both former students of mine in UCD and are now teaching there in their own right. So they've made a big contribution to a lot of the work that you'll see this evening. We'd also like to thank Kevin Donovan and Niamh Nivoran, who worked with us for a number of years a few years ago and have also made a big contribution to some of the work that you'll see. I suppose we start by saying that we're primarily interested in the practice of architecture. And we consider that architecture emerges from the constant engagement with the conditions of client, site, brief, and budget. So that is to say that we bring our own ideas and concerns to each project, but they only become manifest through their encounter with those circumstantial conditions. So in this sense, the design process for us creates meaning out of intent through countless small everyday acts. Making drawings and models, meeting clients, visiting site, writing specifications and letters. The ordinary acts of practice that in some ways go without saying and are then often missing from architectural discourse. We would also consider that architectural design is its own form of knowledge and is by nature synthetic. So I suppose this is a slightly long-winded way of saying that we're not intending to present a position in this lecture, or that we would even particularly aspire to holding one. Instead, we are going to show a series of projects, because I suppose we attempt to make each project a careful response to the given conditions. So we're going to show a series of projects. In a way, we've thought about this more as a slideshow than a lecture. But we'd hope through that series of projects that you would get some insight into the way that we work and some of the outcomes of that process. Each project starts with an idea about space. And this idea is normally thought about firstly in plan and is then gradually elaborated in terms of expression, material, and construction. So space for us is primary, and for that reason, the lecture is organized in two parts, and the first part is about domestic space, and the second part is about public space. And we're not quite certain how these two parts relate to each other. So we're going to start the discussion of domestic space with this photograph, which is a little bit washed out. This photograph of Coderc's Casa Ugalde outside Barcelona, which was completed in 1953. And I suppose from our time in Barcelona onwards, Coderc has been a really important influence for us and is the subject of my ongoing research. So we're influenced, obviously, by his buildings and projects, but also by a kind of ethical stance, which I suppose is expressed most succinctly in his essay, "It Isn't Geniuses We Need Right Now," where he argues for the creation of a living tradition in modern architecture. But I suppose in the context of this lecture, we're particularly drawn to the space of the Ugalda House as described in this photograph, which is for us aperspectival and complex, with light from a number of different orientations, but which also has a simplicity of expression and an economy of means. So this is a photograph that we actually often show to clients at the outset of new projects. So related to that photograph, I suppose we put up a series of plans of houses that we really enjoy and that we often refer to and look at in the office. And I suppose, in a way, what all of these houses by different architects have is a certain kind of engagement with the particular, which for us gives them a real sense of domesticity. But then they also have this kind of looseness and open-endedness, which is something that we really enjoy and try to develop in our own projects. So these, I suppose, are some of our recent projects, and I suppose there are kind of modest attempts at something similar. And I suppose what we've enjoyed about working in this way is a sense that the form is not fixed from the outset, that there is a kind of loose opening strategy which can then easily respond to the developing conditions of the project. So we can have a real and purposeful dialogue with clients, with other consultants, with the contractor. We spend an inordinate amount of time drawing plans, drawing and overlaying plans, and I suppose this is probably the part of the process that we enjoy the most. And I suppose for us, the plan enables us to grapple with all of those particularities of domestic life. From thinking about things like pieces of furniture that the clients might own and want to incorporate, to the kind of minutiae of domestic life, things like laundry and buggies and sports equipment. We kind of enjoy the way that the plan enables us to engage with all those things. And we try not to put ourselves in a position where we're defending a fixed strategy, but instead, I suppose, try to fix on a loose strategy that can then develop and hopefully be enriched through the process.
So we're working on and have completed a series of these domestic projects over the last number of years. Many of them are house extensions, but there have also been a small number of one-off houses. And even though these projects are often quite small, we're going to show one this evening that involves an addition of just 7 square meters. We do find that they allow us to explore some of the central themes in architecture, such as ground, roof, wall, and opening. And we deliberately try to explore a different method of construction in each of these projects. But there is one particular theme that tends to recur, and that is this idea of the thickened wall. This idea that you might elaborate a more complex threshold between inside and out. And we really like making these deep overhangs, which we find work really well in the Irish climate, because on a day like today, you can leave a door or a window open. And we also enjoy making these built-in seats in the thickness of the wall between house and garden. So the first of these domestic projects that we're going to show you, we call Terracotta House. And it's a 1950s semi-detached house in Glenageary with a south-facing back garden. And as is typical of many of these houses from this period, the back of the house was very closed to the back garden, these very small openings. So the brief was to extend the living spaces at ground floor level out into the garden and to take advantage of the south-facing orientation. And the clients also had 2 specific requests. Andrew, who's a medic, spends most of his working day in a hospital environment, so they really wanted the palette of materials internally to feel very warm. And then secondly, they had this very special painting that they wanted to find a home for, that they brought back from their time living in Australia. So these were some of the first drawings that we would have shown to the clients in order to open up the discussion. And we showed them more than one strategy, which was really to sort of generate a conversation about the project. And these are also the kinds of drawings that we would show at this stage, so that nothing feels very fixed, still feels quite loose. And we also showed them the image that Michael just showed you of the Casa Ugalda with the tiled floor and the white angled walls, which they really liked. They were very enthusiastic about that, so we agreed that we'd progress the lower option. Following on from that, then, there would have been a whole series of plan overlays exploring different ways of making this room in the garden, different configurations that would capture slightly different views or that would alter the way the light entered the space. And then we also explored different positions for a fireplace and for a window seat. And then this is the final layout, which is a little bit washed out. But you can see that the most of the rear wall at ground floor level is removed, and then the kitchen is organised like a piece of furniture in the middle of the plan. It's semi-open to the playroom on one side, and then it opens out to this new room in the garden. And then in section there are 3 steps down, which allows us to make a slightly taller space in the garden, and then there's a roof light introduced between old and new, bringing light down into the kitchen. And then this is a model that Jennifer made for the Describing Architecture exhibition in 2010, 1:100 model in plywood. And it was interesting because this model was being made in the office just as the 1:1 version was starting on site. So these are the first traces of the cranked walls in the ground. And then this is a view down to the new tall space in the garden with the external blockwork walls to which 150mm insulation was applied. And this insulation would have been hot wire cut on site in order to achieve the very sharp angles. So there's no cavity in this construction, which means that you get the benefit of the thermal mass of the blockwork walls. And then this is a view of the completed project, where we made a piece of solid wall in the dining space to house the canvas from Australia. So it's very visible as you enter the house from the hallway, and then it can also be viewed from each of the living spaces. And then this is the room in the garden, the dining space, where you get this thickened wall housing an Oroco window seat. And then the floor and parts of the kitchen are also made in the same Oroco. The roof joists are exposed, and then this is the roof light bringing light down into the kitchen. The kitchen floor and the steps are made in this terracotta tile from Italy. The same tile is then used to clad the external window seat and the reveals, and this wall becomes sort of like a double thickness, where you get the Oroco seat to the interior and then the tiled seat to the garden. And then the parts of the walls that aren't clad in the tile are finished in an acrylic render, and then the same tile again is used to make elements in the garden like a barbecue, steps and low walls, and then it combines with a washed concrete finish to make a terrace. And then this is a series of site photos that we took from the bottom of the garden, which shows the progression of the project. And then this is the same view at completion.
So the next project we call 7 square meters. And I suppose this is a very different kind of challenge in a way. The project was for a Victorian terraced house in Donnybrook and Belmont Avenue, which the clients had just purchased. And I suppose these show the kind of condition of both the back and the interior. It had been broken up into flats, so it was in quite a bad condition. And I suppose in a way the challenge in this case was quite different, and a lot of the conversations at the beginning were about how little one could do, because actually they had plenty of space. This is quite a big house. But I suppose the issue was just really to refurbish the house and to try and open it up to the garden at the rear. And also, I suppose there was a kind of imbalance in the house between the amount of living space and the amount of bedroom space. So there were a lot of bedrooms and not much living space, so somehow the project had to try and deal with that. I'm not sure how visible that is. I could try doing this reversal to see how that works.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. So I suppose the other thing to say just from the section drawing is that there's a split level arrangement where it's obviously 2 stories to the front and 3 stories to the back. So a lot of the project was really about this lower ground floor and how to open it up to the garden and how to try and make the most use of it. So in the end, we proposed these 2 very small extensions. One of them a small extension to the main body of the house, and the other a small extension to the return, which replaced a small lean-to kind of kitchen that had been there. So in the end, it was an extension of 7 square meters. And the other thing we did was to make a new staircase in the middle of the plan, which links the kitchen up to the main room at the front and then further up again to a new kind of living den space on the first floor. So they were really the moves that were involved. And I suppose we can go back again. This model, I suppose, describes that. And in a way, we were thinking of the intervention as being a kind of thick screen that was then pulled slightly away from the existing house and allowed for the creation of 2 large roof lights that got as much light down into the plan as possible. So it was really this almost freestanding element which was placed in front of the lower ground floor. And we were interested in the idea of making that screen in situ concrete. We had done this project in Sandymount a number of years ago, which again was a sort of idea about making a freestanding concrete screen which was pulled away from the rear wall of the house. So that was kind of an interest and was partly about a relationship to the existing materials, the hard cement on the back of the house. But essentially the project is really about this thick screen and these 2 roof lights that it creates. So this is a view of one of those kind of thick walls which makes a seat in what will be the dining area. And that's Jennifer relaxing in part of her creation. And you can see, I suppose, the way just that pulls away and then has a large frameless roof light above. And again, that window seat is lined in a Roco, and in this case there's also a polished concrete floor. So I suppose this section shows the construction, which is an in situ, a kind of deep in situ concrete wall, which is dry lined internally. We made a little overhang again, and we then introduced some of these blue ceramic tiles, which just give another kind of warmth and definition to the elevations. So I suppose in this one you begin to see that idea of the sort of relationship of the concrete, which is sandblasted, to the existing hard cement walls on the rear of these houses. So this is a view just of the extension to the main body of the house. We also took the bricks from the small lean-to extension that we had knocked down. We used them to make this brick terrace in front of that bay window. And then I suppose this detail shows again that thing of how we were looking at the concrete and the kind of mix of that concrete in terms of how it would relate to the back of the house. This, as I should have said, is a protected structure, so I suppose part of that was always about thinking about how this thing could harmonize with that context. So that just shows the detail of the concrete and the concrete overhang, the Iroko window and the ceramic tiles. And I suppose this is just the view of that small project from the garden with the terrace, with a series of circular paving slabs through the lawn, and then with this small concrete extension.
So the next project, this is a project we've just received planning permission for in the last few weeks, and it's a house for a family just outside Kilmore in South County Wexford. So the site is on farmland where the client grew up, and this is the site here at A. And this is the house where she grew up. This is where the farmhouse where she grew up and where her mother still lives. And it had a really interesting collection of outbuildings just behind the house. And this was one shed that we particularly liked, with the big heavy stone walls and a singular roof that's just held off the ground on this side. And then there are the ruins of a mid-19th century Church of Ireland church and graveyard to the north of the site at C. And then this is the last remaining tower, Norman Tower of Ballyhealy Castle, just to the south of the site. And then it's about a 15-minute walk down to the beach in this direction. So this is a sketch site plan, which we would have showed to the clients quite early on. The site slopes gently to the southeast, and then there's a line of existing trees and hedgerows protecting it from the road. And this drawing was really about trying to show how we might capture those very particular views to the tower to the south, and then to the ruins to the north. And then there's quite a fine house called Ballyhealy House, which is also quite visible further off in the distance. And then we started with this idea about making a living space that would have this structural fireplace holding the corner, and that would then open up to the views of the tower. So we really started with this idea. This was the starting point for the project, and everything else grew from this. This is a view from the living space looking back up in the other direction to the dining space, and then the kitchen beyond, and then there's this window in the kitchen that frames a view of the church ruins. And then this is a view of the house from the entrance to the site. So it reads as a very simple form in the landscape, with the Norman Tower just visible beyond. And then this is the site section showing the relationship between the new house, the ruins, and the tower. Do you want to do? Yeah. Okay. So then the plan, the ground floor plan, it's quite a compact form. It's pulled away on the north side to make an entrance to the house, and then it's manipulated in order to take advantage of these views. So then the sleeping areas are organised on the east side, getting the morning sun, and then this is a playroom, living space and dining area opening up to the south and to the west and getting views to the tower. There's a small change in section which helps to give definition to the living spaces. And then from a structural point of view, the intention is that there be a cross beam arrangement holding the roof that would meet at this point. And then there's a garden store, a small garden store, and a home office organised separate to the main house. There's a small first floor level that houses a guest bedroom and a small study area. And then the intention is that the external walls would be finished in a lime render, timber windows, and then that the hipped roof would be finished in a natural slate, which would tie in with the vernacular buildings in the area. And then Connor's model shows this idea of thickened wall to the south and west. Again, this idea of inhabiting this space and also giving protection from the high summer sun. And then this is the cutaway on the north side to make the entrance to the house.
So the next project we're going to show, which is Dublin House, Fishamble Street, came out of an ideas competition that was run in 2009 as part of the Now What Summer School in UCD, which was organised by Fiona Hughes and Alice Clancy and James Rossa O'Hare. So in conjunction with Ali Graham and Dublin City Council, they ran an ideas competition for a site in Dominic Street, and really looking for another model for developing housing in the city centre. Really looking at this idea of, was there a sort of small-scale development model that would work along the lines of the way that the Georgian city had developed originally, and that would be based somehow on those original Georgian plots. So there was an ideas competition which we were lucky to win, and we won jointly with 3 DIT students at the time, Cormac Nolan, Jamie Conway and Elizabeth Gaynor. So we were subsequently then asked by Dublin City Council to develop that proposal for Dominic Street and to make a brochure. And then a couple of years later we were asked to look at a site in Fishamble Street, which is just right opposite the atrium of the Dublin Civic offices. And again, we developed a proposal for this and made a brochure, and they're currently trying to work on a tender procedure where they would invite people to come and bid for this site, with the idea that a group of people or an extended family or a group of friends would come together and develop this site themselves, and would be given the site for quite a low figure by Dublin City Council. So I suppose we were just going to briefly talk about this evening, I suppose, partly because we've always had an interest in housing. We've done a number of projects, none of which have really been built for different reasons. But I suppose we wanted to represent some of that work, and we were just going to very briefly talk about this really in terms of the project itself rather than the kind of mechanisms involved in Dublin House. So this was a drawing, I don't know how clear it is, but we made a drawing for the RHA summer exhibition a couple of years ago. We were invited by Des McMahon to contribute. So we made this drawing as a kind of way of trying to summarise that work that we'd done on this project. And I suppose really for us it was an idea about this 3 and 2 section, which is something that we've been interested in for a long time and explored in a number of different projects. And I suppose what really interested us about this was the kind of economy of the section, where it creates these sort of 1.5 height rooms, which are in our head equivalent to kind of Georgian rooms, that have a really nice scale. They're kind of 3.6 or 3.8 meters high, that kind of scale. And then on the other side of the section, where you have the 3 related floors, you get a kind of normal size accommodation, which can work for bedrooms and kitchens and things. So we've kind of really enjoyed that, and I suppose part of it is the idea that of trying to bring, again, ideas about the particular into a collective housing project. So somehow the idea that an apartment could have the same kind of spatial richness that one of those house projects could have. So that was something that we were exploring. So I suppose just to show briefly how this worked in this version. So the idea, we were kind of thinking of it as a sort of extended family. So on the ground floor there was something that could serve as a workshop or possibly a retail unit or a small office. Above that was a dwelling for a small family. Above that, again in the red, we were thinking of a dwelling for a retired couple, and above that was an idea of an apartment for, say, 3 individuals who were sharing. So I suppose, in a way, within the one section, which is effectively a house, you would try and accommodate all of these kinds of households. So I suppose just to show, this is the idea for one of the family apartment. So you kind of enter into a hallway, and here you enter into a hallway, and in this case there's bedrooms, and then you come up half a level to the large living space, and then up another half level to the kitchen, to possibly another bedroom or an office or something, and those rooms then have a relationship back at a half level back across the living room. So trying within that dwelling to get this kind of complexity, and again, this kind of enjoyment of the particular. So trying to think about all of those things about laundry and all of those things that are a big part of domestic life. So this was the elevation of the project. I don't know how clear that is. This is the elevation to Fishamble Street, so obviously the river is at the bottom, and in this case, again, trying to think about this as a sort of thick inhabited screen, in this case a brick screen, which shows, I suppose, the variation in the section where you get some of these tall rooms and other lower rooms. So this is the model of that project, which again was made for presentation and for trying to encourage people to get involved. And I suppose it quite clearly shows that thing of this, what we were thinking as a screen facade, and then this kind of worked section behind that. So that's the first part of the lecture. The second part is about public space. And I suppose, again, this section starts with a photograph from Barcelona. And I suppose we had won the Kilkenny competition in 1999. And we worked on it for a year, and then for political reasons it kind of died a death at that stage. And we subsequently then moved to Barcelona a couple of years later. So I suppose in a way, in our heads, the project was ongoing, even though there wasn't really any sign of it coming back at that stage, but we were kind of thinking that we were still doing the project. So we spent a lot of time looking at, and obviously Barcelona was a good place to go for that. We spent a lot of time looking at this kind of work. And I suppose we were really struck, I suppose what we're interested in this image in particular is that somehow this seems to combine a kind of modesty and ambition in one project. So it's modest in the sense that it's a very restrained intervention, and it doesn't in any way try to predetermine the use of that space. It leaves that very open. But it's also very ambitious in only using a ground surface and some very discrete other elements to completely transform that situation, and in a sense to make a kind of non-nostalgic contemporary public realm. So we spent a lot of time going around looking at the ground, effectively. And this was obviously in the years before we had small children. So we were able to freely roam the globe in pursuit of ever finer examples of coffee, wine, and paving slabs. And I suppose in these photos it looks like it's a kind of example of different articulated ground surface, same casual jacket. But I suppose we have a huge archive of these photographs, of really just going around and becoming kind of slightly obsessed with these ground surfaces. And I suppose we became really interested in Stan Allen's phrase where he talks about the thick 2D of landscape. So we were very interested in the drainage and tactility and of these surfaces. And I suppose in a way how the modest act of making a pavement could contribute to the civic life of a town or city.
And then we also, you could say, developed quite a particular method of making drawings for this kind of work, which is probably quite different to the kind of drawing that we would make for the domestic work. And this is a selection of the drawings that we made for the Kilkenny project, which became part of an exhibition in UCD called Common Ground in 2010. And I should say that these A5 drawings were meticulously pinned to the wall by Kevin Donovan. You can't see it in this image, but they sit just proud of the surface of the wall. And that was made with the help of an Arts Council bursary as well. So we're going to describe the works to the Riverside Walk in Kilkenny, known as Canal Walk. And this would have formed part of the larger project to the parade, which leads up to the entrance to the castle. So this is Roke's map from 1758, where you can see the castle, the city walls, this is the parade space, and then the River Nore. And then this is a sketch view of our project for the parade and for the gravel walk. This site plan then locates the canal walk in the context of the city. So it starts at Canal Square beside John's Bridge, and then it runs as far as a pedestrian entrance to the castle grounds. And then these are two photos from the Lawrence collection. This is a view from John's Bridge of Canal Walk with the castle above. And then this is a view from the castle showing the formal rose garden, and then this dramatic drop down to the river and Canal Walk. So before the works started, the surface to Canal Walk was very poor. It was very dark, and there was this wall blocking any views down to the river. It was also very poorly lit. In fact, there was no lighting, so it was quite unsafe at night, and there was no street furniture, no benches, nowhere to sit. And then this is a sketch view of our proposal for the space. So we proposed that we'd make a new ground surface and then make a new railing, opening up views down to the river. These are the kinds of drawings that we would have made for presentations to, say, councillors and to the city manager. So then we wanted to make a railing as light as we possibly could. So this railing is made up of a series of 12 mil circular stainless steel elements. And we raised the level of the walk throughout to minimise the potential of flooding. And then, so the original wall, the base of the original wall is retained, and a new concrete capping is applied. So then the railing is anchored into this capping, so you don't see any fixings from the walk side. And then this is an example of one of the drawings that we would have made for construction stage. So you get a 1 to 10 part plan and part section, which is then elaborated underneath that scale of 1 to 5. So we would have made a series of these drawings for each of the spaces in the project. The plan then shows the canal walk with this sort of head and tail, where the walk is made up of a polished concrete surface with granite strips at 4-metre intervals, and then the head is Canal Square, and then the tail finishes where the pedestrian entrance enters the castle grounds. And the granite would have been the same material that we used in the larger parade space on the other side. This is a photograph of the concrete before it was polished. So this is just after it had been poured, and the formwork is still in place waiting for the slabs of granite. And we tried to make this detail where we merged the stone with the polished concrete at either end. This is the completed walk then with this, the polished concrete surface appears as a very reflective surface. And then a night view showing how the wall to the castle is uplit. You can see that it stops quite abruptly here, and that's because the last third of the walk has not yet been completed because there was a health and safety issue with the wall to the castle. The contractor came on site and said that it was bulging and it was therefore unsafe. So we would hope that it would be completed at some point in the near future. Canal Square then, similar to the parade space, was essentially being used as a car park before any works were carried out. And there's this stone gate lodge on one side that rests on the river edge. And then there was an ESB substation built up against the wall to the castle, and the ESB refused to relocate it, so we had to try and come up with a proposal for that as well. So the space is pedestrianised, some benches are introduced, and a screen is made around the substation. It's the completed space with polished concrete benches on one side, capturing the south sun. And then this shows the space being used during the Kilkenny Arts Festival. So it's become a space that they use for smaller events. The screen to the substation then, we tried to use that as a way to explore the possibilities of concrete a little bit further. So we made a series of rectangular and curved elements, 75mm elements that are polished before they're assembled, and then they're tied together at the head and the foot, and then there are flush stainless steel doors that give access to the substation. And then this is a view of the walk from John's Bridge.
So the next project we're going to talk about is this project for a horse caravan base, which is near Rathdrum in County Wicklow. So I suppose Kevin will remember this well, but we were approached by a family called the Clismans, who've been running this business for the last 40 years or so, where they rent out these horse caravans to tourists in the summer season, and the tourists go around the landscape in South Wicklow, and they basically start at their base and come back to their base. And they had an existing centre which was quite close to the N11, but they'd had problems with a quarry nearby which was kind of having an impact, and so eventually they bought another site, a really fantastic 80-acre site, which was an old Christmas tree farm sold by Quilcha, further up close to Rathdrum, and they asked us to design a base as well as a house for them. We had an AI site visit, which was in 2010. Is that 2010?
2010, May 2010, yeah.
And which was a really great event, a really fantastic day. And then literally the week after, things went very wrong with the contractor, who kind of did lots of very dodgy things, to the extent that Grace has actually photoshopped out his face and, and put in somebody else's face from
Dutch
the internet. So if you recognise the other guy, we don't know, but because we didn't really want to look at him in the lecture. So I suppose this image, I don't know how clear it is. Yeah, it's pretty clear. Shows the site, this 80-acre, really beautiful site that they purchased, which has a stream or a small river running through the middle of it, and the ground slopes down to that. And I suppose the brief was really for a yard, which is the main thing, which is the kind of organising element. There were a series of hay barns, which could also serve to store the caravans during the winter. There was a kind of routes room where they would explain the routes and talk to their visitors about where they would go. A room for harnessing, showers and toilets, and then a house for the family. And so a lot of the brief and a lot of the discussion was about how to organise that relationship between the house and the base. So I suppose this is an early model that Kevin had made, which was looking at this sloping site and how to make something that would integrate with that slope or would feel like part of that landscape. And I suppose it was an idea really from the beginning about making these quite simple forms and these quite simple monopitch roofs, which would then adapt themselves to the slope. And we had started by looking, this is Neil McCullough's drawing of farmhouse typologies. So we'd obviously started looking at these in the way that a series of very simple buildings enclosed a space, and that space then in some ways might open up or close to the landscape in different ways. We were also looking at Aalto's amazing plan of the funeral chapels, and I suppose in this case it was a way, I suppose what we were interested in is the way that the plan kind of extends out into the landscape. So it makes a series of enclosed spaces, but then also has this openness to the landscape and openness to its context. So that was something that we were looking at a lot at the time. And we were also looking at some of these precedents from Siza and Tavora and the Brazilian architect Bratka, where they were making these kind of semi-covered spaces. So trying to make this kind of language of undercroft, which would make these sheltered spaces. And in a way, I think from the beginning we saw that maybe that was, in a way, what the architecture could bring to this project, would be something that wasn't really in the brief, which was these kind of overhang, semi-enclosed spaces, which could be used in a variety of ways in the operation of the base. So that was sort of an idea from the beginning. So these are quite a lot of sketches. I think these are all Kevin's sketches. Really exploring that thing of the organization of this project and also the form of it, the way that these series of monopitch roofs could be organized in relation to the slope of the site. So this, I'm not sure how clear that is.
No.
Should we try and reverse it?
Yeah.
That's pretty funky now. So I suppose this shows the plan. So there's an existing forestry road which we used here as the entrance, and then there's a sloped entrance space which serves as the car park and ramps up to the main entrance. And effectively at this point, which is where the reception is located, there is a kind of lock in the plan where you either go through into the main yard and the visitor centre, or else you go through into a courtyard around which the house is organised. So this point kind of serves as the sort of key knuckle in the plan. So there's the yard, for which we were given precise dimensions. They wanted it to be exactly the same size as the yard they had before. To the north of that, there are a series of hay barns. And then below that, there's a harness room, showers and toilets, and the roots room here. And then the house is organised at half levels to that entrance courtyard with the living areas below and the bedrooms above. And there's also a small computer workshop here, which is kind of freestanding but slightly connected to the house, which was a business that one of the owners ran as well. So, go back. So this is the model of that, and I suppose the way that these large monopitch roofs get organised in the landscape, and then the way that we use a cut and fill of the levels to try and define these different areas. So the main yard, the entrance space, and then some of these private terraces which relate to the house. And this is a series of cross sections. I think they're fairly visible. Basically through the yard space, showing a series of those different conditions and the way that the project both cuts and fills the land. And this is an elevation basically to the west side. So again, showing the yard in the middle, these monopitch roofs, and this kind of entrance space which is made here. So this is a view of the project as it is now. We got another contractor on site, and we've completed a kind of second phase of the project. So all the visitors' facilities and things are finished. The house is sealed, but it hasn't been completed. It hasn't been fitted out on the inside and hasn't been fully completed on the outside. But Otherwise, the kind of visitors' facilities are complete and are kind of ready. So I suppose you can see this kind of really beautiful site and the way then that this tries to sit into this landscape. And I suppose we had an idea really that the expression of it would really be about these series of beams in the landscape, and then there would always be a view under those beams. So you would always get this kind of connection and see the way that the land and the ground was manipulated. So this is the yard space, which has this series of hay barns on this side, and then an undercroft space on the other side. So that's that kind of undercroft space, which has these large concrete beams and then a timber roof structure. And I suppose that space then becomes a space where they can work on the caravans, they can store the caravans, give them shelter during the winter, as well as all the other kind of activities that go on. And then this is just a view down. This is one of these connections which goes down and out to the landscape and connects to the visitors' showers and toilets, which are below. So I suppose, I mean, we should say as well that the budget was exceptionally tight, so it was always really about, and I suppose taking on that kind of language of farm buildings and the sort of modesty of construction and trying to use that as much as possible. So this is a view, this is that computer room, which again, there's a roof that goes over to connect it back to the house, and that frames a view through to the landscape beyond. And these are the hay barns. This was actually taken at the AI site visit a number of years ago, with that concrete beam structure and the timber roofs above. This is a demonstration area. So there's an area here which again is covered by the roof where they can show the visitors how to harness the horses and all of those kind of things. So they can all sit on these steps and the demonstration can happen here. And then on the other side of the roofs room, we've made this kind of generous terrace with a view out to the landscape, which again is used for kind of social events and events once connected with the start of the visitors' trips. So the final image is just of that yard. There's a series of these large sliding folding screens, and then those hay barns are also used for storing the caravans and repairing the caravans.
So this is then the winning entry for an ideas competition run by Documomo last year. The challenge was to propose a new use for the iconic Sam Stevenson building on Dame Street, because the central bank is supposed to move to a building on the quays in the next few years. So we thought it might be interesting to propose that it would become a secondary school, which was partly in response to the recent RAAI schools competition. So we began to apply a typical Department of Education brief to the building. So this is the existing section through the bank with the double basement housing the vaults and the car parking, and then the office floors are above, hung from the giant roof structure. So we started making cuts in the urban floor to open up the basement below, and then the teaching spaces and the classrooms are housed in the upper levels. And we introduced a new roof that spanned across the entire site between ground level and the soffit of the office levels. It becomes like this light-filled cover over the main public spaces of the school. This is a... Do you
want to try reversing that? See what happens.
It's dramatic. So the sports hall and general purpose area are located at basement level. So the idea is that they can be viewed into from the street, and then equally the students can watch the world go by as they're playing sport or having lunch. And so the idea is that these spaces invite the city in, and that there's also an idea about them being shared by the greater community, that you might have an amateur drama production or a community meeting in the evening, or that they might be used as a market at the weekends. This is the ground floor plan, which shows an entrance courtyard onto Dame Street and a bridge connection through to a lobby area, which is located between the two existing circulation cores. And we were thinking of this space as one giant central square, a little bit like the central space in the School of Architecture in Sao Paulo by Villanova Artigas. This is a typical upper level plan then, where there's an existing 7-metre dimension between the cores and the glass facade, which works quite well with the prescribed apartment classroom sizes. And then we started to manipulate the existing facade and pull it back and make voids and gardens as external teaching spaces. So we were referring to the open-air school in Amsterdam by Jan Dijker from 1930, where you get this tower of classrooms opening out onto external teaching spaces. And the night view then presents the ground floor spaces as these lit spaces inviting the city in. So the school doesn't present a front door as such, it's more like a continuation of the street into the public rooms.
So the last project we're going to show is this project for the landscaping of the Waterford Viking Triangle, which we have just very recently completed. So I suppose this project, the Kilkenny project, in the end took about 10 years to complete, basically from 1999 till 2009. But this project, which is the second, I suppose, public realm project we've done, has basically gone from start to finish in about a year and a half. So it's been a very different experience. And the project is for the Viking Triangle, which is the oldest part of Waterford City and is one of the oldest urban quarters in the country. And basically, Waterford have put a lot of energy and investment into this area, trying to make it as a kind of tourism centre for the city. So they've built a new museum. They've converted the Bishop's Palace, which is a building by John Roberts. They've converted that into a museum. They've obviously built the kind of Waterford Crystal Visitor Centre. So there's kind of ongoing long-term project to try and revitalise this area. And I suppose our project then was to deal with the interstitial space to try and make the public realm and the kind of setting for this area. So this shows this kind of historical view looking across the river at Reginald's Tower. And I suppose the sketch shows the sort of setting in that there's a series of really significant national monuments: Reginald's Tower, the Friary, the Deanery, Christchurch Cathedral, and the Bishop's Palace. And in a way, our project is just about knitting those together or dealing with the space in between them. So this is the plan. I'll try and reverse that, see what happens. So I suppose in this case, there was a very clear brief for this project. And one thing that they had done, Waterford City Council, with the city architect Rupert Maddock, have done a series of these public realm improvement projects throughout the city. And they had established a very clear palette of materials that they wanted to use, which were primarily Irish blue limestone, Kilkenny or Carlow limestone, a Portuguese granite, which they liked because it had a texture, but it also had quite a light colour, and a Ballylusk gravel, which is a compacted gravel which comes from Wicklow. So in a way, they were given, they were set in the brief. These are the materials that we were asked to use. So in a way, the challenge at the start was to think about how to structure those, or use those materials to structure the space. So we had decided on a strategy where we would make effectively a limestone precinct around the cathedral. So this is the cathedral here, and historically that would have been a separate precinct, would have been walled off and would have been separate. So we thought we would try and re-establish the identity of that through the use of material. So it's effectively a limestone precinct, but it has these inset areas of the compacted gravel. And then we'd use the granite for the other streets. And for this space, this new space which we made at the Friary, and then carrying down to connect to the space at Reginald's Tower down by the river. So that was really the kind of ordering, or the kind of ordering of the brief that we brought to the process. I don't know how clear, it's probably fairly clear. So I suppose, as Grace had talked about earlier, there's always this thing of how one works on this kind of project. Because in a way, sort of working in a traditional way through plan and section often doesn't really work, because the changes in section are so small. So at a scale of 1 to 100 or 1 to 200, the section is often just a flat line. So I suppose what the kind of technique we've developed is really to use the plan a lot, and to think about the plan as being a kind of thick 2D in Stan Allen's phrase. So we kind of ended up, even from the beginning, making a lot of these kinds of projects or drawings where we would use collage or use Photoshop to kind of study the plan or study parts of the plan and try and put the detailed material into them, and obviously then making these other kind of sketch drawings to try and work out how to articulate the spaces. And I suppose this would be an example of a detailed study. So again, I suppose because the section is so critical and yet difficult to study, we end up looking at the section at quite a close-in scale, at sort of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, quite early in the process, because I suppose you're thinking about drainage or curbs, which have a huge impact on the space, but then don't really register in the larger drawings. So we end up making these kinds of drawings really quite early in the process. So I suppose this photo shows, in a sense, the palette of materials that we ended up using, where there's granite, which is used for the roadways and the secondary streets. That's defined by 2 granite drainage channels on either side of the roadway. There's then this wide strip of limestone which defines the beginning of that precinct around the church. There's some of the compacted gravel, which you see there, and then the main surface of the limestone are these strips, and we've varied between 2 types, a flamed finish and a peon hammered finish, just to try and give a kind of a sort of life and articulation to the surface. So the limestone is a really beautiful material, but sometimes in large areas it can actually be quite dead, or depending on whether it's wet or dry, I suppose, but we sort of saw that variation as trying to give a bit of liveliness to that surface. So this is the view before we started, looking at the end of this is the new museum here, and then this is the Bishop's Palace. So a big part of the project was trying to organize this space, which was a bit of a mess. And I suppose, again, as we talked about in the Kilkenny project, we used these perspective drawings overlaid on the photographs as a way of first exploring our own ideas within the office, but also as communicating those ideas to the client and councillors. And so effectively the idea for this space was to try to make a raised terrace, which would be at the floor level of the Bishop's Palace. There's a cafe and restaurant in there, which you could then spill out onto that terrace. And somehow by organising, I suppose the idea by organising a piece of flat ground in an otherwise sloping territory, you could kind of charge that space, even though it was quite small. You could sort of establish a terrace against the landscape, which would have a certain power in that situation. So this is the kind of view, just looking at that raised terrace and the way that it sits up against the Bishop's Palace. So this is the view of that space as it's completed with the Bishop's Palace, Christchurch Cathedral, this set of steps up to the terrace. There's a bin store which we had to incorporate, which is for the restaurant. So we kind of made this piece of ground which makes a seat onto the terrace and then tries to sort of hide the bin store on the other side. And I suppose just that, trying to use just that simple palette of materials, which is the limestone, a series of metal balustrades and bollards, and then compacted gravel. This is a view down onto that terrace from the Bishop's Palace. There was also a Michael Warren Spanish War Memorial sculpture, which was kind of sitting on a piece of grass in the middle of that space. So part of it was about giving a setting to that. So the terrace is organised, again, with this kind of thick wall that makes a large limestone bench and makes this flat place where people can sit out and dine. And then on the other side, which is Cathedral Square, the Deanery building, this is the Deanery building from the 1770s at the end. Again, the idea was to try and make quite a simple space with the limestone and then this inset of compacted gravel. There's a chessboard in the middle. And then in front of the Deanery we made a new kind of plinth, which provides a terrace, provides a new set of steps, and provides a ramp access. That's the motor tax office at the moment. And there's going to be a new door case reinstated onto that facade, which is due to happen in the next few weeks. So again, bringing that language of the paving to do with the limestone, making a series of ashlar walls and steps which set up a podium basically, or plinth in front of that building. And then on this side there are a series of simple steel benches and light poles. And then the space in front of the cathedral, this is Henrietta Street. So in this case we narrowed the carriageway of the road and tried to make a kind of wide apron in front of John Roberts' cathedral building. Directly in front of the entrance we used a Kerry red marble inset into the surface just to give again articulation to the entrance to that building. And I suppose again just tried to make as clean and simple a landscape as we could in front of that building. Down at Friary Square, this again was a space that was just used as a car park, and there were a series of railings which kept you away from the walls of the Friary. So we took away the parking and took away those railings and tried to make a very simple granite space running right up to the walls of the National Monument, which again could be used for different kinds of events or for some of the kind of pubs and restaurants along that street to make use of. So I suppose this is a view of that, the walls of the Friary, and then one very simple granite bench which is held on stainless steel angles and just floats off the ground and sits in front of the existing walls. And this is the final image, which is of one of those junctions between the granite roadway and the limestone surface. And I suppose in a way it summarizes something of what we try to do in these projects, which I suppose just by really thinking about that kind of quite ordinary and quite modest act of making a pavement, can you give something back to the civic life of the town or the city? Just by thinking about those kind of simple things of drainage and surface and tactility, can you kind of unlock some potential that might be there in those existing spaces? But then to always try to make that in a sort of non-nostalgic and contemporary way. So thanks very much.